All right, welcome back to the Nexus Podcast. Phil Englert, VP of Medical Device Security with the Health ISAC, is my guest, and we're going to talk about the legacy technology problem in healthcare and the risks it's introducing into patient care and a lot of other stuff having to do with healthcare cybersecurity. So good to meet you.
Very good. Nice to meet you as well, Michael. Thank you.
Of course. Happy to have you. Tell me a little bit about your role in Health ISAC.
So I lead the Medical Device Security Initiative. Really what I do is I bring medical device manufacturers together with healthcare providers to help find that scalable, sustainable, resilient middle ground between, medical devices, but really all of IoT, as well as, the keeping patient safety in mind, keeping data privacy and data protection in mind, and really ensuring that we can continue to do healthcare delivery.
And is that a constant dialogue you're in with manufacturers? And
it is a constant dialogue.
Yeah.
The technology is so expansive. There are so many different layers of infrastructure, types of infrastructure really, that support medical devices, whether it's, simple telemetry for vital signs, through therapeutic devices like defibrillators and infusion pumps, diagnostic stuff like ECGs or EKGs, right through clinical diagnostics, the big chemistry analyzers,
sure.
As well as diagnostic imaging, from ultrasounds to MRIs and PET CTs.
Mm-hmm.
So that technology is it's amazing what it can do. Right, what it can tell us, how it can help us inform the treatment of the human condition, right? And it was built to be consistent, reliable, and accurate, right? Which does not lend itself to the needs of the cybersecurity world today, right? The changing environment, the increased activity, of hackers always looking for a way in. Right, so it's a huge challenge. There's lots of angles to it, lots of conflict, if you will, friction between the two sides.
Mm-hmm.
The medical device manufacturers that really, need to protect the functionality of the device, and the healthcare operators who are really, collecting all of that data off of these devices and then utilizing it to provide patient care.
Right. So in the last few years, it really seems that there's been an elevation of cybersecurity and discussions of patient safety, with good reason. I mean, I'm just curious, did you see a turning point at some point where that became the reality?
So I don't, one of the things that's hard to see is where medical devices are used and are actually impacting patient safety. Right, we know that these weak devices are used as access points. They allow actors to get into the network, to get lateral and vertical movement within the network,
right.
And then exfiltrate data. We've seen patient care interrupted because these devices are ransomed, or they have malware on them and we have to shut that down. What we haven't seen is we haven't recognized a deliberate change in the operation of the device.
Mm-hmm.
So when we talk about care delivery and patient safety, it's really about device availability. And that has two elements, the device itself, right, and the function that it provides, as well as the data that it generates and allows us to make clinical decisions.
Yep. So I'm glad we're meeting today because I know that the FDA recently updated I believe it's their pre-market guidance for cybersecurity for medical devices. A lot in there about secure development practices and the inclusion of that in the development life cycle. Just your thoughts on what stood out in terms of the guidance and what you liked, what you maybe didn't like or wish was in there.
So a couple of things that I really like, right? I call it the Secure 8. Right? It's the basic controls that should be fundamental to any connected technology, if you will. Authentication, do I know who you are? Authorization, what do I allow you to do? Encryption, can I obfuscate the data, right? And then we talk about integrity, not only of the data itself, but the code that runs the machine and provides the clinical functionality, right? Elements like that. Update and patchability is a big thing. This goes into the design and secure development lifecycle, making sure that this device can be supported well into the future. And here's one of those friction points, right? We build these devices using components, whether it's an operating system or libraries that have a useful life or an IT compute life, of maybe 5 or 7 years, but we're putting it in medical devices that can be expected to be operated for 7, 12, 15, even 20 years into the future. So that disparity between component life cycles and product life cycles is really a difficult element and difficult place to manage. Yeah. And that's one of the key areas that I work with both healthcare providers and medical device manufacturers to kind of work through and negotiate that, right? To understand what the risks are, what the impacts, were those risks to be actuated on the devices, right? And then how they could be managed, whether that's through patching and updating, whether it's through, improved monitoring, or isolation or NAC, or just even having a response plan different than a response plan that you might have for traditional IT, where it's restore from backup and reconfigure. Medical devices have to be brought back up much quicker so that we can continue on with the patient care mission that we have.
So are we at a point yet especially with the manufacturers, where secure development, cybersecurity overall are kind of like table stakes, or is there still pushback, or has there ever been pushback, I guess?
So there was pushback, right? Back before, the FDA obtained statutory authority for cybersecurity of medical devices, right? There was a question of whether they really could do it. We knew that cybersecurity issues could impact patient safety, right? But there was that gray space. It wasn't a direct correlation. So when the FDA had statutory authority for safety, right, they were granted with 524B statutory authority for cybersecurity, right? And that was necessary in order for them to really manage this space well. So, it goes to that. One of the brilliant things that I thought the FDA did was said cybersecurity is a quality issue, right? If your device could be made to do something that it's not intended to do, we got a problem. And I love that approach because it gives them a very broad base with which to operate from on that, and it's given the breadth of technology, they couldn't define specific controls for every type of device. So this gives them that kind of wrap. It also gives the healthcare delivery organizations, a angle from which to view, the clinical impacts on a device that the risks and the threats may, realize for them.
How would you characterize the legacy technology problem in healthcare from a cybersecurity perspective, obviously?
So legacy is a challenge, right? Again, the disparity in component life cycles versus product life cycles means that almost every device will become legacy at some point, right? The real key to managing the risks around that, right, is to understand what the threats are and then what the impacts are, so that we're spending our resources to reduce the negative impacts that these devices can have on patient care, patient safety, data protections, right? So that's I think the real key. We're always going to have legacy. It's not going to go away, right? It's like your mom's still operating the flip phone. It's just what they're there, or we're driving a 1970s automobile, that doesn't have all the airbag protections, right? Those are risks that we as humans are willing to take, risks that some organizations have to endure. The real key is to understand, what the dangers are, and then protect yourself as best you can from those dangers, given, the resource constraints that you operate within.
Mm-hmm. What's the FDA's impact on security in healthcare, Ben? Maybe from a day-to-day, like what are some of the differences that are being realized now?
So a couple of things, it was interesting when we saw the hurricane that took out the Baxter plant in South Carolina that produced 70% of the infusion fluids, 70% of that product line, right, in the United States. So they get involved in not just protecting devices, right? But they're protecting the ability of healthcare delivery organizations to deliver care, right? And so they're doing things like watching, the piece. If we look at the recent Stryker incident, there was a lot of concern about the supply chain. Stryker's a monstrous company, right? In the top 10 of medical device manufacturers, but they also do a lot of supply chain stuff, a lot of provisioning of consumables that enable healthcare delivery. And so that's key, right? So they got in, they were concerned about that. We got engaged with HHS. We got engaged with ASPR to understand what the concerns in the supply chain were and how we could do that, whether they needed to step in, find alternate sources. Sometimes, even when we were going through COVID and PPE or personal protection equipment, was scarce. They were identifying resources. They were, accepting devices that weren't previously accepted for marketing in the United States to be used, just to make sure that the safety of both the patients and the caregivers was protected.
I'm glad you brought up the Stryker incident. I'm just curious from a Health ISAC perspective. What happens when there's a major incident like that within your organization? Do the inbound requests start flooding over? I mean, take me through that.
Yeah, so a couple of things, right? The first thing we did is within 8 hours, we had a secure chat channel stood up where our members could exchange what they knew, and much of that in the early stages was, off of Reddit and whatever.
Sure.
Health ISAC coordinated a members call with Stryker, 30 hours right of boom, and invited them out to say, hey, this is what we know, this is what we can tell you, this is that. So, that kind of influence or that kind of information sharing is what the ISAC does, right? It helps people from filling the gaps themselves with their imagination, right? By pointing to truths of source, that are reliable. Stryker was out front not only in talking with our members. They allowed us to open that up to AHA, the American Hospital Association, so that we could even get to a broader audience than just our members. On that, which was remarkable. They've updated their website repeatedly, often several times a day, to bring information out, right? And this was unusual, right? Previously, a manufacturer would say, we've got an incident, we'll let you know, and that never gets updated, right? Or rarely gets updated. They were updating it actively. They were sharing information as well as they could. They got together with GPOs or group purchasing organizations and shared information out that way to help alleviate the worry, so that folks could continue the business of delivering care.
Sure. Just to get back to the FDA for a second and the pre-market submissions guidance, I was just curious your impression in terms of how well is it working in terms of decisions being more consistent, the implementation of some of these requirements. I mean, is it too early, or is this kind of like an ongoing thing before you can measure success?
So it's I think it's getting better, right? I really do. I think the CD cycle, I see manufacturers improving their quality on the front end. They're unifying it so that across different product lines, they've got more consistency, right? They're training their staff up on, their product development teams up on cybersecurity requirements. They've got uniform requirements across their enterprise. So we're seeing consistency in the development, right? At the same time, we're seeing more consistency in the FDA's review process. They've improved their eStar, their electronic submission thing. They continue to expand the documents that are necessary to have a submission that is worth their effort, right? And then they're very interactive, with manufacturers during their submission period. They'll send back questions, ask for clarification. They know that this is new space, right? And all of these processes are iteratively getting more consistent and iteratively getting better quality through that. So, the manufacturers and the FDA are doing a lot of, I don't want to say purposeful cross-training, but just, incidental cross-training on that, and it's working. Mm-hmm. We're seeing it We're seeing also that early stage developers, and startups are recognizing that cyber is going to be essential for them to get approval of their product very early in the market, and so they're beginning to ask these questions, get engaged early on, and that's going to be critical so that the legacy problem doesn't go away but becomes smaller and becomes more manageable.
Sure. I'm curious as to what Health ISAC members, their input on vulnerability management and updating software, updating firmware within devices. All those updates have to go through the FDA, and then the manufacturer pushes out the updates. There's a long, sometimes, window of exposure for a lot of organizations there. What are you hearing in terms of, how can we make this better? What do HDOs want to see there?
Yeah, so I think, it's funny, the HDOs want to see what fits them the best, right? Manufacturers, of course, want to create what fits them the best, and those two don't always mesh up, right, across the board. But we are seeing more consistency. HDOs do not want to be overburdened, either in frequency, or sense of urgency, right? Keeping devices secure should become routine maintenance, much like changing the oil or rotating your tires on a car, right? To keep that there. And I think we're working towards that. I think the other element is, manufacturers are also beginning to separate a little bit the clinical functionality of a device from the interoperable piece. And it's that interoperable piece that presents most of the risk.
Sure.
And it also allows them to update that element much more rapidly, more like a traditional IT, without impacting the clinical functionality. That will shorten the V&V cycle, right? But it's difficult. We've got to, kind of rebuild from the ground up. Newer devices have this, iterating on some of the older technologies is going to take a while for that to really get out. The other thing that I think will be essential for this is the separation of feature development on medical devices and the security updates and patches on medical devices have to, they kind of go hand in glove, but we've got to rethink about how we can separate those to shorten the V&V cycle, to make it consistent on these. We don't have to wait and have, features approved, go through all the quality. We can avoid some of the regulatory burden if we can separate that, just apply security patches without changing functionality of the device.
Right. The interoperability question, just to go back to secure development for a second, that's going to be a huge issue when you're in terms of software development, and you don't want to break stuff with a new feature or an update or what have you. I mean, is that your experience as well?
So the interoperability is the real key. It's where the risk is created, right?
Yeah.
I mean, many of these devices, and I've been in the business for 40 years when many of these devices were not connected, where patient monitoring ended at the equipment closet at the end of the department hall,
Right.
And we've then connected them in. And healthcare is not the only business we see this in. We see it in manufacturing. We see it in energy, where we've got these purpose-built technologies that weren't connected, and now we connect them so that we can monitor them, we can update them, and we've created exposures that now have to be done. So it's that interoperability that creates a lot of the threat surface, that we seek to protect.
Yeah.
But there's certain things we can do even for devices that may not be patchable, right? That may be not even supported any longer, right? But again, understanding what they're connected to, controlling the boundaries, monitoring those boundaries, having a plan, to work and respond if those boundaries are compromised, in a way that's predictable and in a way that doesn't create more harm, than you prevent.
Mm-hmm. And so to go back to vulnerabilities for a second, there's a major vulnerability announced in XYZ medical device. Inside an HDO, when they hear about that, does it conversation immediately go to compensating controls?
So we think,
since
right,
a patch is X number of months away.
Exactly. So knowing that, right, the first thing they do is they turn to the manufacturer and like, what do you recommend us to do? What should we do here, right? And the normal thing is the compensating controls. Do you have this device segmented, right? Can you monitor the traffic in and out of it, can you alert somebody if you see unusual traffic, right? Do you have a response plan if you see that unusual traffic? Do you give your staff, permission to push the Toyota button? Let's stop the line till we know what's going on, right? And I think those are all elements that we've matured into and continue to mature into at different paces.
Mm-hmm. So we don't hear a lot about specific cyber attacks against medical devices, thankfully. Is the window of exposure something that HDO is kind of learning to live with? Or, there are compensating controls, but, in the end, they are still exposed to some degree.
Yeah, so they are exposed, and a couple of things, our HDOs have done a better job of network segmentation. They used to say hospital networks were flat. There was really just one span of it, right? And then they go, we'll fix that. And they had an administrative network, a medical network, and a wireless network, and so that was their segmentation, if you will. And we've continued to mature about that. On that, one of the challenges is the same device might be used in different clinical settings, right, at different acuity levels, and therefore it's difficult to do it by technology and not by clinical purpose, right? And so it's hard to do the segmentation and get it right, and be afraid of getting it wrong, right, and interrupting care. But one of our members, their security architect was telling me, if you start with the stuff nobody cares about, right? Start with the Coke machines, the refrigerators, the ovens, all these things that are connected that are sort of consumer stuff, and teach your organization how to think about, how to plan it, how to execute on it, right? You're still segmenting your networks in a way that protects your bigger crown jewel devices, right? And so those are strategies I think that 10 years ago we hadn't quite figured out, right? We were like, we've got to start with the crown jewels, right? But if you take the little stuff out that nobody cares about, and even if you break it once or twice during that process, you still are isolating your bigger devices from other IoT devices that can hurt you. And think about, medical devices might be 5 to 11% of the endpoints in an acute care setting, right? But the other IoT devices, the access controls, the security cameras, the air handlers and water pumps and all of that make up close to 30% of the connected endpoints. So you can work with some of that stuff and have an impact on your organization, right? Teach your organization how to do it. Teach your different teams how to work together and think through these processes within the controls and constraints of your organization, and really make meaningful progress to reduce, the risks and the threat surface.
Yeah. All right, so before we wrap up, just tell me about what might be coming up on the horizon for the Health ISAC. Any initiatives you're excited about for this year?
So a couple of things. We've got members, a couple member-led groups that are working on what are the metrics that we can use for medical device development, right? And they've divided themselves into two work groups. The executive level, how do we talk it up to get the resourcing that we need to build, and maintain secure devices from a manufacturing perspective? And then what are the metrics that we use for monitoring the quality and the development on the production line, right, in the R&D centers? So that's I'm really excited about that because it's a member group that's driven this. A second initiative we have that I think is really cool is our members said, hey, is there any way that manufacturers, that HDOs will tell us what are the basic controls that we're looking for, right? So that we can make sure that we're building this into our devices, or make sure that even if they're in their devices, that we're articulating in a way that is meaningful to them. So that's pretty exciting. So we've got a group that's doing security baselines. We broke it down into two streams, one for the embedded devices and one for the full operating system devices, because the compute resources on those devices are different. They allow different controls, how much authentication, how much encryption you can have, and things like that. So that will be informative too. We're hoping that reduces, let's say, the procurement length,
Yeah.
the cycle on that, and kind of shorten that, makes it, but also helps our organizations, build devices that are going to be more palatable, in the healthcare environment, right? The next on the loop is what's the horizon then look like, right? If these are the controls we want today, it's not all the controls. If you look at zero trust, that maps very well to 853, and that's 170 plus controls, right? That's a little onerous, right? But if we can organize them into groups that we can then attack and work our way down, I think we're on the right track to really aligning the two elements of what do we produce, and how do we keep that secure once it's in the environment.
All right, great stuff, Phil. Thank you for coming by. I appreciate it.
Very good. Mike, thank you so much. This is a great conversation.
All righty.